Pete Maravich was not born into basketball by accident. From the moment he came into the world on June 22, 1947, in the small steel town of Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, his life was already being shaped by forces far larger than himself. Aliquippa was the kind of place that forged men through labor and hardship, a town where discipline was learned early and dreams were often sacrificed to survival. It was here that Pete was introduced to a world where effort mattered more than comfort, and where identity was built through what a man could endure. At the center of Pete's life stood his father, Peter "Press" Maravich, a former professional basketball player turned coach, and a man who believed deeply that greatness was not a gift, but a responsibility. Press did not see basketball as recreation. To him, the game was structure, control, and purpose. When Pete was still a child, barely old enough to understand the rules, his father placed a basketball in his hands and began shaping him with almost obsessive focus. While other children played for joy, Pete practiced with intent. Dribbling drills went on for hours. Passing angles were refined again and again. Shots were taken from distances that made no sense in that era. There was no applause, no crowd, only repetition. This father-son relationship was complex. It was loving, but demanding. Supportive, yet suffocating. Press Maravich was fiercely protective of Pete, but also relentless in his expectations. Basketball was not merely encouraged, it was enforced. Pete would later admit that much of his childhood felt less like freedom and more like preparation for something he did not fully understand yet. And still, within that pressure, something extraordinary was forming. Pete wasn't just learning how to play basketball, he was learning how to see the game differently. As Press moved through coaching jobs across the country, Pete's childhood became nomadic. New towns, new schools, new environments, yet always the same constant presence: basketball. By the time Pete reached his teenage years, his abilities were already far beyond those of his peers. He handled the ball like it was an extension of his body. His passes were instinctive, creative, almost rebellious. He didn't just react to defenders, he anticipated them. He played as if the game moved slower for him than it did for everyone else. In high school, Pete often played varsity basketball before he was even officially eligible. He was younger, thinner, and less physically developed than many of his opponents, yet he dominated them through skill and imagination. It was during this time that the nickname Pistol Pete was born. His sidearmed shooting motion, unusual and almost theatrical, looked like a gunslinger firing from the hip. The name stuck, but it would become more than a nickname. It became a symbol of who he was: unconventional, flashy, and impossible to ignore. But even as Pete's reputation grew, so did the weight on his shoulders. Playing under the guidance of his father meant that every mistake felt magnified. Every missed shot carried more meaning. Press Maravich was not just a coach on the sidelines. He was a presence in Pete's mind. Success brought approval, but failure brought silence. Over time, Pete learned to associate his value with performance. Basketball became his language, his escape, and his prison all at once. When Press accepted a coaching position at Louisiana State University, Pete followed him south. LSU was not a powerhouse program at the time, but it was about to become something entirely different. NCAA rules prohibited freshmen from playing varsity basketball, forcing Pete to spend his first year on the freshman team. Even there, he made history. In his very first game, he recorded 50 points, 14 rebounds, and 11 assists, a performance so dominant it felt unreal. It was a warning sign to the rest of college basketball that something unprecedented was coming. Once Pete became eligible for varsity play, the transformation was immediate and undeniable. College basketball had never seen anything like him. He scored from everywhere. He passed without looking. He dribbled through defenders as if choreographing a performance rather than executing a play. And he did all of this in an era without a three-point line, without a shot clock, and without the modern spacing that defines today's game. His scoring averages were not just impressive, they were absurd. Over 3 varsity seasons at LSU, Pete Maravich scored 3,167 points, averaging more than 44 points per game. These numbers were not the result of selfishness or system-driven play. They were the byproduct of a player who had mastered creativity under constraint. LSU did not dominate opponents, they did not contend for national championships, but they became relevant. They became must-watch. And at the center of it all stood Pete Maravich, carrying the weight of an entire program on his shoulders. Yet, even as records fell and crowds grew, something was missing. LSU never made the NCAA tournament during Pete's tenure. Critics questioned whether his style could truly elevate a team. Others argued that his brilliance masked deeper flaws. But what most failed to see was that Pete was not playing for validation from the outside world. He was playing to fulfill an expectation that had been placed on him long before he ever stepped onto a college court. By the time his college career ended, Pete Maravich was already a national phenomenon. His highlights circulated like myths. His name was spoken with awe and skepticism in equal measure. He was celebrated and doubted at the same time. And as he prepared to enter the NBA, one question loomed larger than all others. Could a player so unconventional, so creative, and so different survive in a league that valued structure, discipline, and conformity? The answer to that question would define the next chapter of his life and reveal the true cost of being ahead of your time. When Pete Maravich entered the NBA in 1970, he did not arrive quietly. He came with a reputation that preceded him, a mythology built on college highlights that seemed almost fictional. The Atlanta Hawks selected him with the third overall pick in the draft, and with that selection came enormous expectations. To the public, Maravich was a savior, a player who could redefine the game. To his teammates, he was something else entirely, an outsider who arrived with a massive contract and a style that threatened the existing order. The NBA of the early 1970s was not prepared for Pete Maravich. It was a league rooted in structure, hierarchy, and physicality. Creativity existed, but within limits. Maravich's game ignored those limits. His passes bent logic. His dribbling invited risk. His long-range shooting seemed reckless to traditionalists. And yet, it worked. He scored with ease. He created opportunities out of chaos. But what thrilled fans unsettled locker rooms. In Atlanta, Maravich was not the undisputed leader. The Hawks already had established stars, players who had earned their status through years of grind and sacrifice. Maravich, by contrast, arrived with fame, money, and attention. His contract, one of the largest of its time, created resentment before he ever stepped on the floor. Some veterans questioned whether he had earned it. Others viewed his style as selfish, even though his passing numbers told a different story. Despite the tension, Maravich delivered on the court. He averaged over 23 points per game as a rookie, earning a spot on the NBA All-Rookie team. He adjusted, at least partially, learning when to restrain his instincts and when to unleash them. His presence even elevated teammates, allowing other scorers to flourish. But team success remained inconsistent. Atlanta struggled to find cohesion, and early playoff exits became routine. As the seasons passed, Maravich's individual numbers improved. He became an all-star, an all-NBA selection, and one of the league's most recognizable figures. Yet something remained unresolved. Critics argued that his teams did not win enough. Coaches questioned his discipline, and beneath the surface, Pete Maravich began to feel the weight of being misunderstood. For all his brilliance, Maravich often felt alone. He was celebrated as an entertainer, but rarely embraced as a leader. The NBA wanted his highlights, but not always his individuality. And for a man who had been shaped by expectation his entire life, this contradiction created a growing sense of emptiness. He was doing everything he had been trained to do, yet fulfillment remained out of reach. In 1974, a turning point arrived. The expansion New Orleans Jazz were searching for an identity, a player who could put the franchise on the map. Maravich was the obvious choice. He was already a legend in Louisiana from his LSU days, and his style promised excitement. To acquire him, the Jazz traded multiple players and draft picks, signaling their belief that Pete Maravich was not just a star, but a foundation. For the first time in his professional career, Maravich was not just part of a team. He was the team. In New Orleans, the spotlight burned brighter than ever. Every possession ran through him. Every expectation rested on his shoulders. The roster around him was thin, inexperienced, and often overwhelmed. Opposing defenses focused entirely on stopping Maravich, daring others to beat them. The results were mixed. Individually, Pete continued to shine, averaging over 20 points per game and producing moments of brilliance that drew crowds and headlines. But the Jazz struggled. Losses piled up. Frustration grew. And Maravich, once again, found himself carrying more than one player ever should. Then, in the 1976-77 season, Pete Maravich reached a peak that even his harshest critics could not ignore. He led the entire NBA in scoring, averaging over 31 points per game. Night after night, he delivered performances that bordered on the unreal. He scored 40 points with regularity. He broke defensive schemes through improvisation alone. And on one unforgettable night against the New York Knicks, he scored 68 points. an achievement that stood as one of the greatest individual performances in league history. That game was more than a scoring outburst. It was a declaration, a reminder that Pete Maravich was not merely flashy, he was historically great. And yet, even in the midst of that brilliance, the Jazz failed to make the playoffs. The disconnect between individual excellence and team success followed him like a shadow. As his career progressed, the physical toll began to surface. Knee injuries, initially dismissed as minor, became chronic. Surgeries stole his explosiveness. Pain altered his movement. The joy that once defined his play was slowly replaced by endurance. He continued to produce, continued to entertain, but the cost was mounting. Off the court, Maravich grew increasingly introspective. Fame no longer satisfied him. Records felt hollow. He began questioning the meaning of his success, wondering whether basketball alone could provide the fulfillment he had been chasing his entire life. For a man who had been molded for the game from childhood, this realization was deeply unsettling. As the Jazz prepared to relocate to Utah and the league itself evolved, Pete Maravich found himself at a crossroads. His body was failing him, his role was shrinking, and the game he once dominated with ease was beginning to move on without him. The question was no longer whether Pete Maravich was great. That had already been answered. The question was whether greatness alone was enough to sustain a life built entirely around it. That answer would come sooner, and more painfully, than anyone expected. By the late 1970s, the signs were impossible to ignore. The body that once moved with effortless rhythm now betrayed Pete Maravich at every turn. His knees, damaged by years of punishment and surgeries, no longer responded to his instincts. The creativity was still there, the vision unchanged, but the physical tools that allowed him to express it were fading. For the first time in his life, Pete Maravich could see the limits of something he had always believed to be infinite. When the New Orleans Jazz relocated to Salt Lake City in 1979, Maravich moved with the team, but the transition marked more than a change of city. It marked the beginning of his disappearance from the game. Utah was not New Orleans. The crowds were quieter. The energy was different. And Pete, now physically diminished, struggled to find his place in a team that was beginning to look toward the future rather than the past. Injuries prevented him from practicing consistently, and a new coaching philosophy demanded availability and structure. Maravich, once the centerpiece of everything, found himself confined to the bench. Games passed without his name being called. For a man whose entire identity had been forged through basketball, the silence was deafening. The league that once revolved around his creativity now seemed to be moving forward without him. Eventually, the Jazz made the decision that felt inevitable. Pete Maravich was placed on waivers. It was a quiet ending to a loud career, a transactional moment that stripped away the mythology and reduced a legend to a line on a roster sheet. The move was not cruel. It was business. But to Maravich, it felt like abandonment. The Boston Celtics offered him one final opportunity. Joining a championship-caliber team led by a young Larry Bird, Maravich accepted a reduced role. No longer the star, he became a specialist, a veteran presence off the bench. For the first time in his professional career, he played meaningful playoff basketball. And yet, even in that moment of long-awaited team success, there was an unspoken sadness. This was not the stage he had envisioned for himself. It was a glimpse of what might have been, arriving too late. When the season ended, Pete Maravich made the decision to retire. His body could no longer withstand the demands of the game, and almost cruelly, the NBA introduced the three-point line just as his career ended, a rule that seemed tailor-made for his style, arriving at the precise moment he could no longer benefit from it. Retirement was not liberation, it was collapse. Without basketball, Pete Maravich felt unanchored. For the first time since childhood, there were no practices, no games, no expectations dictating his days. The structure that had defined his life vanished overnight, and in its absence, emptiness took its place. Maravich withdrew from public life. He became reclusive, spending long stretches searching for meaning in places far removed from the hardwood. He explored Eastern philosophies, yoga, strict diets, and spiritual texts. He questioned everything: his success, his sacrifices, and the purpose of a life spent chasing excellence. Basketball, once his refuge, now felt like a chapter closed without resolution. This internal struggle was not dramatic or public. It was quiet, introspective, and deeply personal. Pete Maravich was not running from fame. He was running toward understanding. He wanted to know who he was without the applause, without the ball, without the expectations placed upon him since childhood. Eventually, he found a new anchor in evangelical Christianity. Faith offered him something basketball never had: peace without performance. For the first time, he spoke about fulfillment, not in terms of points or wins, but in terms of purpose. He expressed a desire to be remembered not as a basketball player, but as a man who had found meaning beyond the game. Yet even as he rebuilt his inner life, his body remained a silent battleground. Unbeknownst to him, Pete Maravich had been living his entire life with a rare congenital heart defect. His left coronary artery had never existed. His heart, like his career, had survived through adaptation and compensation. It had carried him further than anyone could have imagined, until it could not anymore. On January 5, 1988, Pete Maravich collapsed during a casual pickup basketball game in California. There was no warning, no dramatic buildup, just a sudden end. He was 40 years old. The news stunned the sports world. The genius who once played with boundless energy had been living on borrowed time. Doctors later confirmed that his condition could have taken his life at any moment, even in childhood. In a tragic irony, the man whose body failed him on the court had been defying biology his entire life. As tributes poured in, the public began to reassess Pete Maravich's legacy. No longer just a highlight machine, no longer just a scorer. He became something more complex, a symbol of brilliance, vulnerability, and the cost of living ahead of your time. But the true weight of his story was not fully understood yet. That would come in the years after his death, as his influence continued to shape the game and his life began to be seen not as a cautionary tale, but as a deeply human one. The final chapter of Pete Maravich's story was not written on the court. It was written in reflection, legacy, and the quiet echoes of a game forever changed by a man who played it differently. In the years following Pete Maravich's death, something remarkable happened. The noise faded. The debates slowed. The arguments about style, winning, and efficiency gradually lost their urgency. What remained was clarity. Distance has a way of revealing truth, and with time, the basketball world began to see Pete Maravich not as a contradiction, but as a pioneer. The game itself evolved in his image. The three-point line became central rather than experimental. Guards were encouraged to shoot from deep, to handle the ball creatively, to pass without looking and attack space with imagination. What was once labeled reckless became celebrated. What was once criticized as undisciplined became foundational. In many ways, modern basketball quietly admitted what it could not say during his lifetime. Pete Maravich had been right all along. Players across generations acknowledged his influence. Magic Johnson openly credited Maravich as the inspiration behind his creativity, and even the nickname Showtime. Young guards studied old grainy footage and found a blueprint for freedom within structure. Coaches who once dismissed his style began teaching elements of it to their players. Pete Maravich, once misunderstood, had become timeless. Yet his legacy was never only about basketball. It was about pressure, about identity, about what happens when a person is defined by talent before they are allowed to discover themselves. From childhood, Pete Maravich was shaped by expectation. He was prepared for greatness, but not for peace. And when the game finally let go of him, he was forced to confront a question he had never been taught to answer. Who am I without basketball? His search for meaning was not a rejection of the game, but an evolution beyond it. Faith gave him what competition never could: rest, purpose without performance, worth without comparison. In his final years, Pete Maravich spoke less about points and records, and more about gratitude and understanding. He wanted to be remembered not for what he did, but for what he had learned. The circumstances of his death added a haunting layer to his story. To discover that he had played his entire life with a heart condition that should have ended it early felt almost symbolic. Pete Maravich did not just play ahead of his time, he lived beyond his limits. Every fast break, every deep shot, every moment of brilliance was borrowed time, even if no one knew it then. He left behind a family too young to fully understand the weight of his absence. His children grew up knowing their father through stories, highlights, and echoes. Yet, even without his physical presence, his influence endured, not just through the game, but through the values he came to embrace: humility, faith, and self-reflection. Today, statues stand where he once played. His name is etched into arenas, record books, and halls of fame. His jerseys are retired, his memorabilia is treasured, but perhaps his greatest monument is invisible. It lives in the way the game is played, in the creativity now encouraged rather than restrained, in the understanding that basketball is not only about control, but about expression. Pete Maravich's story resists simple conclusions. He was not perfect. He did not win championships. He did not fit neatly into traditional definitions of greatness, but he changed the game. And sometimes changing the game matters more than conquering it. In the end, Pete Maravich was a reminder that greatness often arrives before the world is ready for it, that innovation is rarely understood in its own time, and that the most gifted individuals often pay the highest price for seeing what others cannot. He played the game like no one before him. He lived a life shaped by expectation and transformed by reflection. And long after the final buzzer, Pete Maravich remains what he always was, a genius ahead of his time, forever.